Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name's Sheridan. I'm one of the booksellers here. Before we begin, if we could take a moment to silence our cell phones as to not disrupt the event. And when we open up for a Q&A, if you could come to this microphone over here and speak into it so we can all hear you. It's also being live streamed for people to watch later. Tonight, we're joined by Riley Snorton and Darius Bost to discuss their new book, A Black Queer History of the United States. This is the first ever Black history to center queer voices. This landmark study traces the lives of LGBTQ plus Black Americans from slavery to the present day because gender and sexual expression have always been part of the Black freedom struggle. They unearth the often overlooked history of the Black queer community in the United States by interweaving stories of trans and queer figures throughout history, arguing that both gender and sexual expression have been an intrinsical part of Black freedom struggle. Snorton and Bost present historical contributions of Black queer, trans, and gender nonconforming Americans from slavery to the present day to highlight how the fight against racial injustice has always been linked to that of sexual and gender injustice. This book includes a deep dive into the marginalization and unjust criminalization and government legislation of Black, queer, and trans experiences. It also shows how Black Americans have played an integral role in the modern LGBTQ plus movement, countering narratives that have predominantly focused on white Americans. Riley Snorton is a professor of English language and comparative literature at Columbia University and the author of Nobody is Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low, and Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, which has won numerous awards. And Darius Bost is an associate professor of Black Studies and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois Chicago and is the author of an award-winning book, Evidence of Being, The Black Gay Cultural Renaissance and the Politics of Violence. Please join me in welcoming Darius and Riley.
Hello. Oh, great. Um, Thanks so much, Sheridan. Also, thanks to Politics and Prose for hosting this event. Thank you all for being here. It is so cold, so I mean, it's beautiful that you would join us for what is our first book event. Um, Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, hi.
So we wanted to really have this be kind of an open conversation, a continuation of the conversations we've been having. And, this is a work of nonfiction, but we did want to start with a short reading. And so I'm going to read actually the author's note because it gives a little bit of a perspective on who we are to each other and some of the considerations that we had around the book, and then hopefully open from that space to talking more concretely about some of those questions. Um, so I'm going to start with the author's note, which was the last thing that we wrote, and the first page of the book. It's hard to pinpoint when we met, but our first real hangout was in Miami, Florida, at Space, a retreat for Black queer writers in 2015. Some Space folks are in the room. Working on Evidence of Being, the Black Gay Cultural Renaissance, and the Politics of Violence and Black on Both Sides, a racial history of trans identity, we found that we shared language and a common orientation to history being, among many things, a political tool. We knew each other's work, but hadn't yet had the opportunity to get to know each other personally. We both grew up in smaller towns in the Carolinas, both had professional lives prior to entering the academy, both love a kickback and a cookout, and both view friendship as a cherished form of relation. Writing this book offered us the time and space to learn about and from each other. We found ourselves writing on each other's couches, watching documentary films together, and reading each other's book recommendations, and talking about our families, our different expressions of Black queer masculinity, and the state of the world. We began writing this book with a sense that any history of Black queer people in the United States requires grappling with the meanings of each word in the title and the additional layers of meaning they produce when taken together. History is another form of storytelling, and we approach historical figures and events in this book with a keen interest in reviving strategies and recovering and amplifying wisdom for our collective present, and future. As Black and queer specify the kind of history that follows, we take care with identifying when these terms function as verbs as well as nouns. Across the book, we view Blackness and queerness as identities and identifications describing people, places, and communities. Thank you. Appreciate it. Communities as aesthetic, political, and spiritual practices, as ways of seeing and thinking, as structures of feeling, and as conditions for living. We also wrote this book as interdisciplinary scholars of Black, queer, and trans studies, and our archival practices are always shaped by a desire to learn more about our usable past. As a survey, this book is necessarily not exhaustive, and any omissions are not meant to indicate a lack of importance or esteem. Some people we discuss will be more familiar than others, and some well known histories are narrated differently through a Black, queer, and trans lens. We resist limiting what a Black queer history can be, opting to think and write about how Blackness, queerness, and transness indelibly shapes America's national culture, often through confrontations with the state. Just as social movements exist through collective action, this social history is an expression of our collaboration and solidarity. We invite you to continue this work by remembering the histories, personal and otherwise, that make Black, queer, and trans living more possible. So this is our way of trying to set the tone for the conversation. And I wanted to maybe start by opening up around 2023 when we were starting to work on this project together, what some of our commitments and desires were for the book, and maybe how that structures the book itself in terms of its two parts.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you all of Politics and Prose for having us. Yeah, we were talking and trying to remember how this, what we were thinking about in 2023, and the landscape has changed a lot for us. I think, at that time, there was sort of conversations about the AP African American Studies courses and what was left out of those courses, particularly queer color critique, Black queer studies, and thinking about the necessary interventions that we needed to make there, and the possibility that this book might be taught in higher education and in K through 12. Environments as well. They talked about the possibility of doing something for young adults.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think absolutely. So there was a lot of conversation about what the status of Black, queer, and trans history is in Black history. And I think that's one of the, part one is described as proof of existence, in part to kind of think about um, forces, processes of marginalization of Black, queer, trans being, life, movement in the archives and narratives of Black history. But I think part two was also about kind of thinking through, um, what is the relationship between Black queer politics and mainstream LGBTQ politics. And so, starting writing in 2023, I think so much about how we were working on this book and watching news together and um, trying to reorient ourselves in this text in a lot of ways. And I guess um, you know the 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 line about looking for a usable past felt so meaningful in terms of just thinking about um, other moments in time where things were feeling impossible, things were feeling like constricting, and being able to be um, writers, co-writers in a space of trying to think about what strategies were possible then that might be revived for the ongoing, ever shifting present. Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking to Riley, and I talked to other people about, with the shift that has happened. It's, hard to name, but you all know, um, that shift, in this moment where it feels like so many rights are being taken away. I sort of thought about, like, what does it mean for us to have a kind of critique of rights, and this is building on what you're saying about the second part. So, the first part is us really talking about the marginalization of Black queer people in the larger Black freedom movement, of course, within the context of sort of white supremacy and colonialism in their afterlives. But the second part was really us trying to think about, the sort of emergence of autonomous Black, queer, and trans movements in the sort of post 1970s moment. And so, and the two are connected, right? Because, um, you know, the, part of what we say in the book is that because so much of sort of Black, queer, and trans issues were marginalized in the sort of broader Black freedom movement, we were left to sort of have our issues sort of dealt with through the sort of mainstream LGBT movement. And that was in many ways constricting because it was about sort of recognition by the state and these sort of single issue politics that did not grapple with the sort of multi-issue things that Black and queer people were dealing with. But the question for me is like, should we be talking about a critique of rights in a moment when all of our rights are taken away? But, the answer I think, we came away with is yes, right? Because I was just saying this today. I was thinking about SZA's accepted speech at the Grammys, where she was like, the government does not, it's not the end all be all in terms of our existence. So we need a sort of broader movement that's about sort of, multiple ways in which we are sort of approaching our collective survival, our wellness in a holistic way, and sort of rights does not do that for many of us. And so I think that was sort of one thing that sort of stuck with me in this moment. It's like, how critical can we be in a moment where it feels like, we need to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think on one hand, it's like making me think about like what I see as the work of Black study, which is like insisting on the radical imagination, even in moments that might seem to precipitate something like pragmatism. I think, on another way, what you're saying is making me think about like just the tension in writing a history of the United States. And at least that's most of the title, right? And what our choices were around what it meant to kind of think about a historical survey, and the degree to which, like, we were chatting about this earlier. I was like, this is a book that has a lot to do with popular culture, and film is actually a touchdown spot for us a lot. And so I thought maybe it'd be fun to kind of talk a little bit about the themes of the book through the films that we talk about. So the introduction is about kind of starts with Black is, Black ain't. And so maybe that could be one way of also underlining what I think is a kind of shared, although it's not completely shared in the sense that we have the same set of thoughts about history, but I think a shared suspicion about sometimes what the work of history is in terms of making it a kind of linear project about progress. And there's so much about being um, scholars slash students of Black, queer, and trans history that's about engaging with the cyclical nature of time. So maybe we can talk a little bit about Riggs's work and how it was, something we would think with and sit and watch together, and how it opens up the project for us, and by way of the introduction, but also I think it opens up a lot of the concepts that we're trying to think through in the book.
Yeah. I think that, one of the things that is important to us about Riggs and the sort of conception of Black is, Black ain't, is the ellipses that are there, that opening up a range of thinking about Blackness. Um, and and one of the things that we point out is this moment where Riggs is sort of talking about what Blackness meant in earlier moments and being stained with dirt, darkness, conversations about deviance, right? And part of what we wanted to do is to start with thinking about one, the sort of historical construction of Blackness as being constructed through sort of histories of domination and violation in terms of the way that sort of colonial contact and slavery has marked it as this sort of space of domination. And Riggs gave us a way to open up conceptions of Blackness, to think about it in a more expansive way that could be inclusive of queerness and transness. The other thing is that he's writing in a moment or working in a moment and grappling with his own diagnosis of AIDS. And he saw AIDS as something that Black people needed to reappropriate in that moment in the way that we had sort of reclaimed Blackness as something that was dark and dirty, and to sort of make it something that was powerful and beautiful and prideful. But yet there was a struggle in terms of the association of AIDS and stigma. Um, and so part of what, Riggs opens up for us is a kind of thinking about the past where, how do we talk about the sort of long history of the Black freedom movement and the marginalization of folks that, we kind of argue that it was that sort of broader history of neglect that actually made the sort of marginalization of people with AIDS possible. And so that's part of what we are trying to think through in the book is like, how did this become possible? Why is it that in the 1990s that Riggs is trying to get Black people to grapple with this when there's been such a long history of domination within Black communities? And that became a kind of a starting place, I think, for what we were thinking through.
Yeah, and it's also like for folks who may have not seen it in a while, it's kind of amazing who pops up in this film. You've got Bell Hooks and Barbara Smith and Angela Davis are all kind of making appearances, and um, as the film is also asking folks, some folks like who I've mentioned are iconic Black feminists. Some folks, he goes outside of a school and asks some like students, like he's like interested in having Black people talk about what Black is and what Black ain't. And in that kind of practice, we also were like, this is about laying claim to the most expansive sense of the term. And so, one of the things that we do in the introduction is actually talk about a host of folks across the 20th century who are somehow either because their name is Black, because their stage name or performance name is Black. We try to mark the space of we also work on inviting an expansive nature of Blackness by way of it's kind of what I think we both would maybe argue is kind of constitutive queer and transness. So um, we talk about Phil Black. Um, we talk about Georgia Black, who is a trans woman in the early 20th century in Florida. Phil Black, who one might say gives rise to ball culture. We talk about Joan Jett Black, who ran for president a couple of times, and that's her. That was the that's her drag queen name. And we also talk about Angela Davis as an icon who, at the time of the filmmaking, it was still maybe an unsettled question about sexuality, but also to kind of situate Angela Davis's queerness as part of that Black iconicity was also important for us. Yeah. So the other films that we think with, and actually filmmakers, is Cheryl Dunye. And I don't know how many folks have seen Watermelon Woman. But it tells such a powerful allegory about the status of Black queer archives at the time of its making. And we actually end the book by thinking about some of Dunye's later work. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about what those films are doing for the project as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we're grappling with is like, so in that, if you're not familiar with The Watermelon Woman, it's a film that kind of dramatizes the search for a Black queer, and particularly a Black lesbian past. And Dunye, has to invent this history. And so part of what we are trying to grapple with after that film in 1996, the first feature film directed by a Black lesbian, after that film, there, much more sort of popular culture, Black queer popular culture. Moonlight wins an award in 2016. Um, and, sort of the Watermelon Woman sort of concept is that, she finds a sort of actress from the 1930s who plays a mammy, and her name in the credits is the Watermelon Woman. And so for us, it's just like, what happens in a moment where we wouldn't have to search, right, for a sort of Black queerness because it's everywhere and, in certain ways. Now, archivists are sort of including Black queer work. So why now? Why are we writing a sort of a Black queer history? And so we still face sort of marginalization in the archives and still dealing with sort of questions of power in the archive. And we're also grappling with the kind of erasure that's happening on a broad level. But for us, one of the we're looking in the conclusion at Black is Blue, Cheryl's short film about a Black trans man living in Oakland, and part of the dilemma in the book is about their transition and sort of losing um, their partner, who says that you left me to become a man, and it becomes a sort of like marker of a kind of painful past. And part of the way that we are thinking about it is that this is becomes a kind of metaphor for what we're doing in terms of trying to write a Black queer history, where so much of it is about pain, so much is it about trauma, and how do we think about sort of pleasure, community, outside of that history. And so um, there's still a necessity, right, for us to kind of write a Black queer history and sort of, as Riggs was trying to do, wrest it away from these sort of prior notions of Blackness that are always sort of, stained with dirt, as he talks about.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I mean, it's like in listening, I keep thinking about how contradiction just figures so large.
Mhm.
Whether it's kind of thinking about what it means to ethically write about histories and presence of racial sexual terror alongside like pleasure and creativity. I mean, there's so much we bring. A lot of the folks in the book are artists, and I think that there is an opportunity to kind of think about the book as of thinking about the artfulness of survival, and the thinking about like there's a chapter on mostly on musicians, and it's meant to invite like a way of thinking about like working class theorizing of the conditions and circumstances of life, and so I think whether we kind of think about the contradictions of feeling and forces that are going on in the text, or the contradictions around kind of increased representation, Black queer representation, Black trans representation in some ways, and then also actual active forceful erasure of archive, like contradiction was yeah, I think it's almost like a conceptual device that we're trying to work through and around. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of us, as interdisciplinary scholars, as scholars who actually want to sort of think about what it means to queer history, what it means to trans history, and not to think about it just as a sort of umbrella category that we historicize particular figures. It was, um, we were facing a kind of contradiction of, how do you write a Black queer history? Um, and try to reclaim a past to grapple with the sort of like terms of the historical profession that requires you to think, in terms of linear causality, um, and to think about sort of liberal inclusion when, both of our works are sort of rejecting that notion. And so that becomes sort of one of the contradictions that we're trying to work through. I'm writing another monograph. It's really, a kind of critique of historical practice that uses Riley's, Black trans history as a model for thinking about that. And so there's a contradiction for us trying to write a more straightforward history, right, and then grapple with sort of the ways that it can be read um, as this kind of like linear progress narrative. There's also a contradiction that we identify, and I see this in terms of what it would mean to teach this to my students. I don't teach any of my work, but like if I taught this, one of the things that they want to do, and we see it in popular culture, is like reclaim all these figures who may not have identified as queer or trans. That category was not available to them at that time. Um, and so we had to wrestle with that too, in terms of trying to do recovery work, but also trying to honor people's experiences, but also thinking, more critically about how folks, actually use gender and sexuality towards sort of cultural and political ends rather than sort of being named under that category. So we were dealing with how to do this work without sort of reproducing the kind of calcification of these sort of terms of gender and sexuality to honor our perspectives as Black, queer, and trans interdisciplinary scholars, while also sort of meeting the sort of professional demands of having the kind of historical detail and the archival evidence that is required to call something, history.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying makes me think so much about how the book treats a person like James Baldwin, right? Who is in some ways like, folks are really like clear about him as being a Black queer icon, and the book really wants to think with what he has to say about his sexuality, and maybe what that also invites us as folks who feel some connection with him across time to mind about what the grounds of that connection might be, right? So like in some ways I think that there is an obvious like link or relationship to the questions that we have about how to write this history that I think also shape the urgent politics of what it means to think through solidarity. And I think there's something like, being mindful of the fact that Baldwin was kind of not interested in being a black queer icon, that is helpful in this moment as well in terms of thinking about what what things must be held in common, what things must be shared in order to understand um, how our liberations are linked.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because coming back to that sort of conversation about what it means to sort of do historical work, like um, some of the few Black gay histories and historians, claim, some of the work that Baldwin and others, Hansberry, Rustin, but particularly Baldwin, as the sort of beginning of the modern Black gay rights movement. But Baldwin, did not claim himself as gay, even though there's a new history out that's saying that he might have identified himself in certain moments as bisexual. But, I think there's, in certain ways, a sort of question about ethics, right, in terms of what we do, but also sort of mining that refusal
Yeah.
of identity as a way to think about politics that's not necessarily wedded to it. And so, yeah, I mean, it also, looking at that particular moment too, to sort of like turn the lens,
Mm-hmm.
like that's the way that we kind of investigated or dealt with this problem of recovery, of trying to recover these figures, but
Yeah.
also trying to not, expose them to the disciplinary power of the archive.
Yeah.
And so it meant sort of doing the work of kind of critical reflection.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we talk about several figures
Yeah.
in the book that are just like, they didn't really identify this way. So how do we talk about them as Black queer figures?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I really feel like this point around the ethics of minding people's refusal is just,
Yeah.
it's all over the text, and
Yeah.
it's a way of also trying to grapple with, what does it mean to try to start a book in colonial America? um, that there are all kinds of uh, spaces that are rendered opaque for a whole host of reasons that makes the kind of project of history less wedded to the its kind of methodological or disciplinary concern, and much more about an ethical, political project and the stakes of that.
Yeah. And I mean, and I think that, you know, we have to grapple in the archive, and I think it's something that we, grapple with throughout the text, and that's why, in certain ways we have to start with slavery and colonialism because of that. There is really very little evidence, if any, about sort of consensual sexual relations under slavery, and so that becomes another reason that we turn to culture. In that sense, we turn to literature of a contemporary, neo-slave narratives that are trying to imagine something. But like, and part of that goes back to the way that we're trying to expand the notion of Blackness in this moment, because that kind of erasure, we could say, is, just about, domination, right? But that kind of opacity can also be one that yields itself to more pleasurable um, and uh, yeah, more pleasurable, more critical, more political sort of ways of thinking about queerness. That's not always about violation. Um, and so, yeah, and I think that's also like, coming back to Riggs, why those ellipses are so important, because it offers us a sort of range of possibilities for rethinking Blackness. It's not always about sort of, its initial conception and the way that it continues to be thought about in Black studies.
I'm gonna resist just picking that back up. But yeah, no, I think absolutely. So I realize that this is also our opportunity to be in conversation with folks in the room, and so we will maybe move in that direction in the next few minutes or so. But I didn't know if there was something that felt unsaid in what we've been talking about so far. Um, there's a part of me that maybe wants to go back to the question of like, we talked maybe briefly about what we wanted the book to be before we started working on the book. But now I think maybe we can have a last point on what we want the book to be now that it's out and circulating in the world, what we hope this book will do in this time and in other times to come.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're very clear that we don't want this book to be, it's hard to say, I'm not going to say that, but we are discouraging this book to be read as this kind of tool of empowerment, or as this tool that is, for something to say, look how far we've come, right? we can't afford that kind of luxury in this moment, right? And I think going back to what you said, like, I think it, for us, we want to think about it as a kind of usable past. We want to sort of, offer opportunities to think about the range of modes of resistance, right? From ordinary to sort of like more organized movements, um, to music, right? To culture, all these sort of modes that Black queer people have used for their survival, and taking care of one another in the absence of structures of care. Um, and so, that's part of the way that I'm thinking about it now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think so much about there was I remember having a feeling we were like sharing work with each other as we were working on a couple of chapters, and I had this feeling of like hmm, something akin to peace. There was something like, yeah, that was this time that we're writing through right now, or we were writing about at that time was really, really bad.
Yeah.
And folks organized in these various kinds of ways, and there was a pendulum swift, like the pendulum swing, and maybe folks felt like there was a little bit less pressure,
Yeah.
and the pendulum might swing again,
Yeah.
right? But there's something about working through histories that were never, there was no happy ever after
Yeah.
to any of these stories, but there were stories of people keeping each other safe that felt really, I mean, that do feel really grounding in a moment where, um, you know, that is the task, that we keep each other safe.
Yeah.
And so I really resonate with, it's not a project of, um, necessarily of like, we've come so far, because it's like, we what I hope the book will inspire is like, let's look at all these different strategies of people's survival and thriving, and see what we can use now, see what we might need to like let go of. Let's see what we might want to reach out to, because the ongoingness of Black, queer, and trans life is perhaps the constant of this project, more so than time as marked by the state. It's like time that's given by um, the kind of creativity and brilliance um, and collectivity of Black, queer, and trans being.
Yeah. And I'll say one last thing before we hand it off, which is, I, one of the things that I think is, you know, that I sort of dwelled on that, as we were writing, is that um, a lot of the sort of like the backlash against our communities is not just about who we are, but what we have to say. Um, and holding the nation to its highest ideals, right? That's why we can come back to someone like Joan Jett Black, a drag queen who's running for president twice, and mayor. And so, and the last thing that I just wanted to say, and it's sort of, I think, sort of bookending our start with the author's note, is that um, I think it's also about our own practice. That this book required a lot of creativity and working together. I was at Williams College in Williamstown, in the most remote place that I've ever been, and you know, I was going through it because of what was happening, and I was in that space, feeling alone. Riley came to see me in terms of writing. I could call him on the phone, just kind of scream. Um, and I think that, it's important to just reflect on the sort of collaborative and creative production of knowledge is also important in this moment. The togetherness, right? Being with one another, not just in terms of what we are, sort of the historical representation, but the work that we have done together. So I'm grateful. And as I've said publicly, I'll say it again, like, you've renewed my faith in collaboration.
Wow. I'm super grateful to you, Darius. I mean, yeah, this is a book that's also a book about friendship.
Yeah.
It's there, and I feel like I don't know what this project would be if I had tried to write it on my own, if someone had tried to write this book singularly, there's something that happened in the collaboration that I think shapes the book I in what I hope people will appreciate as beautiful ways. So yeah, I feel moved. So let's like open some folks up. We would love to hear from folks here. Any questions about the book? Yeah.
We have a microphone set up right here because we are filming and recording it.
We were thorough.
Hi, friends.
Hi.
So I'm so excited for this book to be in the world and to be in the room with it, and of course to be in the room with y'all. I guess my question is about literature and the literary, right? You both are interdisciplinary scholars. You've talked about the place of art and especially film. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about what's happening with literature, with story. Riley, you began with the author's note thinking about history as a form of storytelling. So I'd love to hear more about story, literature, imagination, as it occurs in your framing of the Black Queer archive, but maybe also as a matter of practice or process. Like, how was your literary process as collaborators? Anything on literature?
Uh-huh. As you That's so funny. Thank you for that question, Mecca. One place that immediately jumps to mind in the text that responds to your question around literature is actually how the kind of first chapter on the erotic life of colonialism and slavery turns to Jewel Gomez's The Gilda Stories and Robert Jones Jr.'s The Prophets to open up a space for thinking about Black queer interiority in the time of slavery, and also like what might pleasurable contact and something like desire, how might desire live? And it had to come through literature to be able to even ask those questions. I think so much of, or to be able to stage something like um, a response to that kind of question. And I think so much of literature and creative production in the book is about gesturing towards what perhaps more quote unquote official archives can't can't say because they weren't organized to respond to that. And I think in terms of the kinds of stories, it's working through literature, it's working through the poetics of blues, it's working through the soundscapes of the movies that we worked with that kind of open onto an area that I think contests what is meant to be evidence of Black, queer, and trans life. And I guess I'll say it like that because um, there are things we know to be true, but may not find their footing in a given state archive, but are so importantly true that we find ways of lifting how these are already in circulation in our reading um, and musical and artistic practice.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mecca. This probably will be reductive, but I mean a couple of things that I can say. One of the things that I think is important about literature, particularly in thinking about it in relationship to history, is its ability to hold multiple affective registers um, in sort of one text, right? And I think that's why we were able to sort of think through sort of consensual queer relations under slavery. I mean, I think another thing is that, I understand history as narrative, as a narrative construction. And storytelling drives what we're doing, right? It's mostly takes the form of these kinds of vignettes, these small stories that we are telling about particular figures who may be well-known figures like Pauli Murray, but we're trying to sort of have a fresh take on the way, and and part of that turns on the way that the story unfolds for us, and it's a way for us to be able to grapple with so many of those contradictions that we were talking about, and as narrative. Uh, um, it also, like, bookending with Cheryl's text, Cheryl's The Watermelon Woman, which is, um, about creation and fiction, right? Um, it, this work is highly speculative, right? And we have so many people now, like Sadia Hartman and others. I'm not putting myself in that category, but who are having to do this kind of speculative work to be able to recover these histories that are largely only available through um, sort of um, court documents, right? And so it requires a lot of imagination and creativity to be able to try to construct something and grapple with all of these things that we were trying to think through as we were writing.
Thank you.
Hey, good evening. Congrats, y'all.
Thank you.
I'm excited to check this out. I've been staring at the cover, and staring at that big black, and staring at that big queer, and thinking about my personal journey of identity and what I call myself. 30 years ago, I was Afro-Caribbean American, but now I'm black, right? And growing up, maybe I started out as gay, lesbian, now identify as queer. And I'm curious about y'all's journey in deciding on the title, but also what y'all saw in your research and history about how folks identified themselves and how we identified as a group in the culture.
You want to start?
I mean, I think, going back to the sort of, I don't know if we really had much say in the terms of queer in the title, but, as we talked about, we wanted to sort of queer Black history. And that meant, in terms of unsettling its sort of foundations, right? Its norms. And so that is one way that we sort of have grappled with queerness, and of course, sort of thinking about queerness expansively to talk about even, we include Linda Taylor, whose life story is the substance of the welfare queen stereotype as someone who is heterosexual but who gets marked as queer because of her non-normative sexual activities. And so we have a broad range. We talk about the sort of the closet as a sort of dominant metaphor for gay rights, but for Black people, that has been something that has happened collectively. They've been outed collectively by the state, but also the sort of ways that certain queer leaders in the Black movement have had a sort of their sexuality has always been tied to the image of the race. And so we are thinking about queerness in terms of the sort of queerness of Black identity writ large, and not a kind of individual way. I think one place that I think about, and I'm sure you can think about others, is like we don't necessarily talk about sort of like we do in a certain sense, but like I'm thinking about Pauli Murray, and the way that sort of multiple ways that people reclaim Pauli Murray as I don't know, all the pronouns that people have talked about, and part of the issue with sort of trying to name the folks whose identities have changed over time is that they get fixed by the way that we recover them in the archive. And so, again, that's why we wanted to think about queerness and Blackness in this expansive way to allow for shifts and changes across time and across space. And we have multiple people who might be, thought about as, transitioning, right? But they are actually moving through various kinds of categories that we can't name in a kind of binary construction, even if that's one that is sort of trying to challenge binary gender, right?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I will just add one small thing to what you've laid out, which is that, like, I think everything that you were saying makes me feel so connected to the idea that we really wanted to look at the title, which we didn't have a lot to say over, but I think we thought of the title as like having each of those words function as nouns and verbs. And so as verbs, it gave us more terrain with which to tell stories about people and movements in the past. And, Black as verb also broadens the scope of what, brings Blackness to the Americas. What's the temporality of those things? We talked a lot at the very beginning of writing this book about, the degree to which we wanted to be faithful about this being a history of the United States. And there are moments across the book where I think we're trying to gesture toward the beyondness of the nation state, that is also critically important. So we trace the steps of Josephine Baker and think a lot about expats, including Baldwin and Baker and so many Black queer folks who found something like maybe reprieve or just other ways of being tied into community by virtue of not being here. And that was important to this story as well. Yeah.
And through solidarity, right, with the third world movements. And I just would add one more thing, which is like in terms of thinking about Black as verb. In the second section, when we are trying to situate contemporary Black queer and trans movements within the broader modern LGBT rights movement, it also meant that we had to interrogate how terms like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender are marked by whiteness, right? And part of the claim that we're making is that the these autonomous movements came from the fact that there was a sort of understanding that these categories were monoracial, right? That they include a sort of expansive way. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been sort of like, say, in the homophile movement in the 50s and 60s, where they were understanding themselves like other minorities, instead of thinking about people who can inhabit multiple identities. So so there is also interrogating the sort of these terms as raced,
Yes.
the sort of marriage equality as raced, and so I think that's part of the way that we're grappling with those terms too.
Well, I think there could be if there's another question, happy to take it, but also we could also have informal conversation. Um, oh, yes, please.
Hello, adding my congrats on
Thank
the
you.
book
It's so
and
good
the
to see you.
event. I have like 4 questions. Let me try to just say some things and
Okay.
you can respond to what you want. Interested in like audience and purpose in this moment, doing a little mini project on like South Asian queer history just from like 1986 to now, because there's a particular magazine that happened in that space that just got archived. So we're going to do a celebration of that. I'm curious like how far back you went, what the actual like research process was, what the like publication process was, like all the different things that go into having a book event at Politics and Prose and sitting here today, like any parts of that that you want to talk about. But, just for me, I had this stack of magazines that I was like, now I need to get these archived and they need to be available because we are not the first and people created something out of nothing. And so I'm wondering like what that nuance is between like celebrating that in like a very surface way, but also just knowing we have, queer ancestors who created that community when there were no rights, no laws to even be taken away.
Exactly.
And so, if we're in that land again, as we work to do that on one register, how we know we can do that again now. And so, I want the young people of today to see that and know that. So, I just was curious about your thoughts on audience and like how this book can help to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that, and can I say, I don't know if I can say this, but like,
Yes. Yes, you can.
like I think that like Beacon sort of like beat the jargon out of us because we are trying to sort of write to a general audience. And the reason I bring that up is because, you know, I think we all know, coming back to sort of Mecca's question about literature, which is to me also a question about language, right? That there's some things that we say in jargon because it's harder to say. Um, and so, and in certain ways, that also can feel reductive when we do it. And so, one of the things that, you know, was different, completely different about writing this book is the sort of like post-production process. I have never been through anything that thorough. You have no idea how many times we went back to write a book that is somewhere between academic and trade press. It's been very different for us, and so that's one thing that comes to mind. I mean, the only thing that I can say about the sort of celebratory piece is like we need to celebrate. Like I don't know what else to say.
Yeah.
Um, you know, in this moment, I don't think we should be afraid of that because of sort of our concern about the kind of the politics of it. But I think celebration
Yeah.
is
It's
a
an
part.
important part of the
Yeah,
living in the contradictions. You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like, absolutely, absolutely. And I hear your point too about the production, post production phase. I think the other thing, maybe, we designed a set of questions to accompany the book that we hope that educators will use, and it's kind of organized in general questions and then also by chapter by chapter. There is a feature of the book that will be adapted specifically for young audiences, and it's really exciting to kind of think about that. In the Revisioning History series, there's a strong YA adaptation kind of history, and the most recent one that I saw is also in graphic novel, which I would be really excited to explore that with this book. So, I think there is also in wanting, like, pick telling stories of folks who are really well known and then telling stories of folks who are lesser known, and that having a balance of folks in that way. uh when I think about the circulation of the text is also exciting, because I'm just like, right, it's maybe asking, it obviously requires a kind of different touch or a different set of questions with folks who are really known, and those who are and on what grounds they are known by, or something like that. And then I want to celebrate the folks whose names are do not come as readily to people's mouths. I think that there is something about crafting a history that puts folks alongside each other, that's also resisting the kind of politics of celebrity, or something that also shapes how the kind of historical survey is often framed or discussed.
And I mean, and that's also like, you know, coming back to the I don't know how to, like, more general audience, or
Yeah.
like, because like one of the things, you know, for me, it's just like we do talk a lot about figures who are known among our, you know, in our profession, right? It's just like, how will other queer historians read this, or you know, people who work on queer culture, because they know a lot of these stories, but we can't assume. I mean, we didn't write the book, you know, for them, and so like this sort of assuming that people know these figures, even though they're well known to us, is one of the things that we have to talk about. But, one of the ways that we try to grapple with that is like, even again, talking about the Baldwin piece, like, if historians have said this moment where Baldwin is doing this is the beginning of the modern Black gay rights movement, right? We can sort of address some of the questions that historians have asked or the debates in the field, but yet sort of talk about some of the, give a kind of overview of these people's life stories, and then talk about particular things that I think are relevant. So it's a balance, right, in terms of trying to speak to our colleagues and our peers in the field, as well as, write a book that is going to be it's an introductory text, like that's what it's meant to do. And this series at Beacon is really sort of, that's what this series is about. And it sells a lot in terms of people who teach this book, primarily to sort of undergraduate sort of intro courses, and again, has that sort of possibility of having a young adult audience. And so it is a kind of balance in terms of thinking about it. I also would say, I don't know where you're going to put your archival stuff, but there's, so many places that you should do it. And I say that to say, like, we both were like, we know this material, but it was also very difficult, right? To try to, like, I don't know if it was about organizing it. It was about what you can say and what you can't put into this book. But I also wanted to say that, like, there's so much of it available online, right, that people can approach it. And so part of what we are also doing is to try to sort of say, like, some of it is wrong. I mean, like, actually, a lot of it is wrong. And so in certain ways, it is a kind of correcting the record, but it's also kind of like, I think part of the project is a kind of a synthesis. And that is what the work that I felt like we were doing. And so the difficulty was the synthesis of it.
Yeah, and what you're also saying, I think, too, about the archive, and some folks getting it wrong, is like, archive is not self-evident. It's not like, it's not the proof of existence. So I think we're also in ways that resist the jargon of, higher ed, like, we're trying to, like, really underscore that these are interpretations, right? Like, we're interpreting text where we are maybe using a different inflection point to look at a story that folks have told in a different way. So yeah.
So, Riley and Darius, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. This is an amazing conversation, and I'm thrilled that this ended up becoming the launch for your event.
Thank you.
And they are going to sign books afterwards. And because this is their launch, they really do want to sell their books, so please buy the books. They're available at the registers. And then you can come up and have them signed. So can we give them a round of applause?
Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you.